get started with some introductions and some housekeeping. Good afternoon. I'm Carrie Den Herrera, Assistant Director of Health Promotion at Healthy Capital District, New York. Welcome to our 5th and final installment of this peer professional development series focused on the evidence-based life-saving role of the Medicaid reimbursable certified peer. If you are interested in how a certified peer can impact and grow your reach within your community or organization, I encourage you to reach out to any of the presenters and myself, and also to utilize the link that's below my contact information in the chat, which will bring you to our past presentations and resources and assets. Also, I encourage all of you to put your contact information in the chat as well, and also the role that you play in your organization. So hopefully some networking can happen too. For continuing education credits today, due to the change in presenters, we are still pending for ASAP New York credits, but we are approved for OASAS and MSW, and we anticipate the ASAP New York credits will come through any day now. Also, at the end of today, there will be a survey for your continuing education credits. You need to stay on for the remainder of, the duration of the presentation, but you will also need to complete a survey for the continuation credits. But for the survey at the end today, we ask that everybody fills that out because it gives us the feedback that we need to make sure that we're meeting your expectations for these presentations, and also helps us in planning future ones, and of course drives funding too. A few quick housekeeping items: if you haven't already, please mute, and all resources, related materials, the slides and the recording will be sent out next Thursday. We ask that you put questions in the chat. We hope that we will get to them all today, but if not, those will also be addressed in the email next week. We are so thrilled and grateful to have Stephen, Samra, and Caron presenting today and sharing their incredible journeys and dedication to their work and expertise on supporting the reentry populations. And we couldn't have had this event without our terrific collaboration with SAMHSA/Born, ASAP New York, and also without our wonderful partnership with Friends of Recovery New York. And to tell you more about that is Teresa Noor.
Hi, everybody. So I'm so thrilled with how this whole series has gone. This has just really been, I'm like, get those nodding heads. Yeah, this has been incredible. I mean, not only is it free training, which we're all going, yeah. Thank you to our partners. I see Katie and Emily are here from Opioid Response Network. So for those who don't know Friends of Recovery New York, we're that connecting tissue. We're the folks that are the statewide recovery community organization, and we got our fingers out there on the pulse of whatever's happening with all the local recovery community organizations, and then trying to reach up to national and other statewide affiliations. And our partnership with Healthy Capital District has been so fruitful already. It really is true that we get more done when we work together. It's amazing. So if anyone is interested in Friends of Recovery New York, I will put a link in the chat to our website that will tell you all about, well, certainly our conference coming up is one of the things that I definitely would be remiss if I didn't mention. The New York State Recovery Conference is going to be offering up to 16.5 credits for CERPA, CARC, CASAC, CPP, CPS, and social work credits. So we are thrilled to death to be offering a virtual conference again this year and having up to 16 credits, lots of international speakers, wonderful workshops that are homegrown, are generated, just from some of the folks in this room. So I will put the link in the chat to all the other advocacy work that we're doing and education and training, but I'm going to just pass it over to our sponsors. Yes, so from ORN, gonna say hey to y'all next. I don't know, Katie or Emily, who's gonna pop in.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Santiago. I'm the Assistant Project Director for the Opioid Response Network, New York and New Jersey region, and I'm joined by my colleague, Katie Cunningham, who's a Technology Transfer Specialist. So we're so excited to be here today and great to see this turnout. So the ORN is a SAMHSA-funded organization that provides technical assistance to programs and organizations in the areas of prevention, treatment, and recovery for substance use disorders. And we specifically focus on opioid and stimulant use disorders, but we also provide technical assistance for substance use disorder in general. And all of our services are free of charge. So if you are interested in learning more about the Opioid Response Network or bringing similar trainings to your programs or organizations, please feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to answer any questions or have a conversation with you, even if you're not sure. Oh, thank you so much, Stephen. So that is our contact information. That's our website. If you're interested in learning more, submitting a technical assistance request, you can send an email or give us a call, whichever you feel more comfortable with. And we'll also include our contact information in the chat, so you can reach out to us directly, because basically if you submit a request, you will end up back with us. So if you have any questions or again are unsure whether something that your program is doing could qualify as a technical assistance request, again, more than happy to answer any of those questions. And I will now pass it to our lovely presenters.
Fantastic, Emily, thank you. And when you see the slides around the Opioid Response Network, and they talk about you are going to be working with a technology transfer specialist, folks like Emily and Catherine, Katie. They mean it. They are experts in prevention, treatment, and recovery, and they work really hard to make sure you get what you need and not what we all think you might need. So reach out, feel free. It's fantastic, and they take good care of everybody that they're working with. So Emily and Katie, thank you. And Carrie, it's such a pleasure to be here. We're thrilled to be able to participate and share what Emil and I both have experienced in our own lives over the last 20 years or so, particularly related to the recovery journey. So just so everybody knows, I'm Stephen Samra, and I'm joined by Emil Caron, and Emil and I are both people in long-term recovery. You're going to hear chunks of our story as we move through this. We use them in very targeted ways as appropriate. But we've got a lot of stuff to cover, and we're going to dive in pretty quickly. Let me hit the objectives really quick. And I know when you see that, it's like, good Lord, how much stuff do you think we can retain? You can't retain all of it. We get it. But what I want to make sure is that even though we have this plethora of learning objectives, what it'll do is help you have the knowledge from all of these objectives, and you can do your own sort of deep dive. We've got a lot of resources, a lot of handouts. There is plenty of opportunity to follow up, get a deeper dive on everything, just about everything I think we talk about. No, everything that we're going to talk about today. So we'll go through these really quickly, discuss at least 3 consequences of a failed reentry effort, recall at least 4 challenges in bringing medication-assisted treatment into jails or prisons, excuse me, identify at least 5 best practices when introducing MAT into a jail or prison, describe the impact of stigma and bias on treatment and recovery, explain post-incarceration syndrome, restate at least 6 barriers to successful reentry for the returning citizen, cite at least 5 examples of peer support interventions to overcome the barriers to reentry, interpret the subcultures of addiction and incarceration and their impact on that pre-contemplative individual, describe the importance of building social capital for that returning citizen, want to discuss the rationale for harm reduction in approaches for that returning citizen. We'll be able to differentiate the difference between drug court versus traditional court and why it matters. And then we should be able to describe at least 2 reasons drug courts are effective alternatives to traditional court. So as we move through today's presentation, if you have questions, please try to hold them until QA. And if we don't get through all of it and have to burn up the, right up to the end, we will respond to any questions that come in, and we'll do it by email. We'll get them to Carrie, our responses as quickly as possible, and make sure you get your questions answered. If there's something that you really need clarification on, you really need, you need to know right now, just let us know, pop in, unmute, and say, hey, can I just ask? We'll try to, do a concise response to that. And then if we need to add more info, we'll follow up in the email. So I hope that works for everybody. And with that, we're on our way. So in order to understand how peers actually can assist with transition out of jail or prison and have a successful reentry experience for the person, we got to briefly understand why peers are even needed in the first place. And it's no surprise the criminal justice system in our country is massive. And at any one time, there's about 7 million people that are on probation, in jail, in prison, or on parole in the US. Each year, more than 600,000 individuals come out of state and federal prisons, and another 10 million cycle through local jails. More than 2/3 of prisoners are rearrested within 3 years of their release. Half of those folks who have been arrested, I almost said popped, excuse me. Half of those folks who have been released will be rearrested, and half of them are going to be reincarcerated. At least 1 in 4 folks who go to jail going to be arrested again within the same year. And often these folks are dealing with poverty, with mental illness, with substance use disorders, and those problems only worsen with incarceration. And I'm generalizing, obviously, but you all know that there's a large chunk of us, self-included, who deal with all those things in and out of prison. Now, a lot of people are impacted by mass incarceration than the 2 million individuals who are currently in the system. There's about, I think the estimate is about 19 million people burdened with those collateral consequences of a felony conviction. And this includes currently and formerly incarcerated people. And if you don't know what a collateral consequence is, it is another thing that's attached to sort of the punishment, the punitive action that you're paying, with your crime. And that could be things like, you are blocked from housing. Your conviction bars you from a certain employment. There's about 70,000 of them on the books across the country, and most of us don't have any clue what they are until we get arrested, get a felony, and then we start finding out about those collateral consequences. So, excuse me. We know that 79 million folks here have a criminal record of some kind, and this is probably an underestimate because it leaves out everybody who has a misdemeanor. There's a whole bunch of us who have those as well. And then there's a report that 113 million adults, or about 45%, have had an immediate family member who's been incarcerated for at least one night. Incarceration also drives poverty, and we know a study at Villanova concluded that mass incarceration increased the US poverty rate by about 20%. And there's another study that found a family's probability of being poor 40% greater if the father is incarcerated, and minority children, they are particularly at risk. And it's likely that because Black Americans are incarcerated in state prisons nearly 5 times the rate of white Americans, and nationally, 1 in 81 Black adults in the US is serving time in state prison. Wisconsin, it leads the nation. 1 of every 36 Black Wisconsinites is in prison. In 12 states, more than half the prison population is Black. Alabama, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Mississippi, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. 7 states maintain a Black-white disparity larger than 9-to-1. California, Connecticut, Iowa, Maine, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Wisconsin. And Latinx individuals incarcerated in state prisons at a rate 1.3 times the incarceration of whites. Ethnic disparities are highest in Massachusetts, which reports an ethnic differential of 4.1 to 1. An estimated almost 97,000 males in state prison and another 9,100 in federal prison, veterans. Just boggles the mind. As I mentioned earlier, mass incarceration is a major driver of poverty, and without it, there is some data that really suggests at least 5 million fewer Americans would have been poor between 1980 and 2014. So when reentry fails, the impact often can be and usually is pretty severe. It means more crime, more victims, more pressure on already strained state and municipal budgets. And there's family distress here, there's community instability. 1 in 28 children currently have a parent behind bars. I'll say it again because it's true. Mass incarceration has been a major driver of poverty, particularly for minorities. And before we do anything else today, I just want to make sure we understand fully the challenge we're up against regarding the potential for a return to use, recidivism, and overdose. Now, we're going to use several different terms to describe the gold standard of treatment for opioid use disorder, or OUD, medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, medications for opioid use disorder, or MOOD, and my personal favorite, because I think it most accurately describes this topic, medication-assisted recovery, or MAR. For today's purposes, I'm going to use MAT throughout because it is the most common term, even though it's severely stigmatized. But I don't think that, won't be long before MOOD and MAR both kind of enter that stigma world as well. Language matters, and stigma is sneaky and it evolves. So perhaps the single most important thing we can do to not only prevent a return to use of illicit opioids, but to prevent an overdose for people whose tolerance to the drug has disappeared, but that mindset of how much to use is still stuck on the dose amount they were using before arrest. And trust me, I know this from my own lived experience. So getting folks started on MAT also gives people a chance to stabilize, to stop chasing the bag, and become receptive enough to actually listen to the input of a recovery coach, a counselor, a therapist, a probation or parole officer, the judge, and others that are charged with supporting this person into recovery. But as you all know, there are some real challenges in bringing MAT to a jail or to a prison. Now there's a handout here, it's called Use of Medication-Assisted Treatment for Opioid Use Disorder in Criminal Justice Settings. You're going to get another one that's going to be similar, but it's going to be in jail-based settings. Everything that I am going to share here is in these handouts, and you can do a much deeper dive as you need to. So we know that opioid addiction and reentry, these are dangerous combination, and it kills a lot of our returning citizens. Whoever just leaves within 2 weeks, that person is 129 times more likely to die from an overdose compared to folks in the general public. But only 30 out of 5,100 prisons and jails offered MAT in 2017. But we've known for a long time that MAT is the evidence-based treatment. It is the gold standard for opioid addiction. 14 states offered methadone or buprenorphine maintenance for jail or prison inmates in 2018. But the opioid crisis started in the 90s when that, the first wave of OxyContin hit. We started seeing the first deaths that were connected to legal prescription opioids. There was a 2018 study where participants with OUDs were 80% less likely to graduate from drug court. And it might be because approximately 50% of drug courts required participants to either discontinue their methadone or buprenorphine within 30 days or, face the penalties. And less than 50% of drug court participants with an OUD received MAT in 2018. 45% of state and federal prisons referred inmates for methadone maintenance after release in 2009. 29% of state and federal prisons in the US provided referrals for community buprenorphine providers in 2009. Without MAT, there was a 10 to 40% higher risk of death from overdose within the 2 weeks of release from prison. Again, that 2018 study. Less than 5% of persons with OUDs referred to treatment in 2014 by probation, parole, or court authorities received methadone or buprenorphine, compared to 41% referred by non-criminal justice sources. Now, folks, we've known since the 90s opioids were out of control. 20 years later, in 2015, the age-adjusted rate of drug overdoses, 16.3 per 100,000. It was more than 2.5 times the rate we had in 1999. And for guys, it went from 8.2 in 99 to 20.8 in 2015. And for the females out there, 3.9 in 99 to 11.8 in 2015. Getting Matt into the system isn't and hasn't been easy. But stories like the one Emil will share, the one that, my experience, they have actually opened some doors, and we're not just the only ones. But as more and more research and understanding about the disease and not the moral failing of addiction comes, the more we are making progress in changing how we approach the opioid use disorder and substance use disorders generally. So, why is it so darn hard to get Matt into a jail or prison? There's a number of reasons. First, there's a misunderstanding or this lack of information. There's reluctance at some points in the system, particularly around leadership, to use Matt, and it comes from that misunderstanding and the mechanisms by which these medications actually work. There are some officials and there's some practitioners who see this. Heck, there's some peers, the recovery community, there's folks in here. We see this, or some of us see this, as replacing one addictive drug for another. Some people believe that you've got to force that withdrawal from the opioid in order to live a clean lifestyle. I don't even use the term clean anymore because it's so stigmatizing. The current policies don't support MAT. Some jails and prisons just have policies that prohibit the use of any controlled substance, including the medications that we use in MAT. And some drug courts may require you go through a detox from either one of them as a condition of their participation. And a lot of folks don't have any providers. There are no trained providers anyway. They don't have the capacity to treat a substance use disorder. And folks who are already on that may be forced to disrupt that treatment when they're incarcerated. And I've done a jail kick and it was horrific. And when they say it might lead to psychological or physiological problems, they're not kidding. Some jails and prisons will arrange for a community-based provider to bring in MAT. But again, a lot of facilities just don't have the medical personnel even to do that. The medically supported withdrawal services are available, but there is no maintenance therapy. And so what that means is that you can get a short-term detox when you go in. But the problem is that it causes super high rates of post-release overdose and death. And jails and prisons may only provide the methadone maintenance if they're registered with the DEA as an opioid treatment center. That's a big lift for folks. And there's a one way around this is to make methadone, and I'm talking about methadone, not buprenorphine, because there's different requirements for that, to make it accessible through agreements with community-based opioid treatment providers. Always concerns about security and liability in the criminal justice setting. And there are concerns about the risk of diversion that causes a lot of jail and drug courts to either limit or deny access to both buprenorphine and methadone. Now, I'm going to tell you just a couple things really quickly. So first, when I was in the penitentiary for my nonviolent drug crime, the strongest heroin I ever used, I obtained in prison. It's not a place where we can pin our hopes on keeping people, free from illicit substances. And I want to talk a minute about this diversion issue because I hear it all the time. And I hear about, the potential for misuse a lot. And look, diversion, it happens. But I'm going to tell you all, particularly on the outside, if you're paying for your treatment, and thank God we've got an expanded system of insurance now that will help with this. But most of the time, and again, I'm speaking generally here, but most of the time, we don't want to give up the medication that we have. I don't know a whole lot of folks who use opioids who are just passing them around like candy. Those things matter to us because they keep us well. So, diverting them isn't the top priority for us. But here's where that can happen. If you're going to a methadone clinic and you're paying, when I left the clinic and switched to buprenorphine in 2014, the cost was $460 a month. Now, a lot of folks I know could never afford that. And if you can't pay, you get a rapid detox out of the clinic. You get done in 10 days. 10 days detoxing on methadone is miserable, and you know that you will not be well when you leave. Here's the thing. If you swing a couple of your doses, if you sell them, you likely have enough to pay for another month of treatment. That is a terrible position to put people in, and it's one of the reasons I think, MAT, it needs to come without any, cost attached to it. And if you can pay for it, fantastic. But if you can't, there's no reason you shouldn't get it. Also, the cost of it just alone in this setting, it might not be offered because there's not a lot of funding here. But here's the rub. We know that treatment on average about 4 to 7 times more effective than incarceration. So if the budget's tight, it kind of makes sense to focus on getting folks into treatment and getting them out of the system, the CJ system entirely. I think reducing the cost burden on the system and the taxpayers is still a really high priority. And we do have a way to do exactly that using MAT. Now, there's a handout, it's called Jail-Based Medication Assisted Treatment, Promising Practices, Guidelines, and Resources for the Field. And in that handout I provided, there's a quote by Jonathan Thompson, who is the executive director of the National Sheriff's Association. And Mr. Thompson just tells us that historically, it's not been the responsibility of the sheriff and jail administrators to be providers of substance use treatment. But thousands of Americans are dying every week, and those recently released from jail are among the most defenseless. The situation has changed, and sheriffs have taken on the challenge. That's pretty encouraging. And then you have James Pavlitek, and I hope I pronounced that right. He is the an executive officer with the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare. He's saying that medication-assisted treatment is widely held to be the cornerstone of best practice from recovery from substance use. Effective treatment, including MAT, particularly when coupled with an evidence-based behavioral treatment, peer support, psychosocial support, etc., improves medical and mental health outcomes, and it reduces both relapse and recidivism. So we're going to take a couple of looks at these promising practices, then we'll move on further because the rest of this training really builds on the effective use of jail-based MAT and the role that peers play in that as part of a reentry approach for folks who do have an opioid use disorder. Excuse me. Again, you can find all this stuff in the best practices for jail-based MAT. We want to make everyone aware of the scope that there are effective medication treatments available, that stigma hurts us in getting people to come for that treatment, and that with the right services and supports, people can, do, and will remain in recovery. Now, we won't cover all of these because we could frankly do an entire training around just the best practices for jail-based MAT. And all of this best practice information is in that handout. There's also additional recommendations in the earlier handout. This is the one that is the SAMHSA's use of medication-assisted treatment in criminal justice settings. And remember, I told you there's 2. They're kind of close, but they really are different. And it might be better if I just, I was going to share a story that Actually, Emil, you know what? I do want you to share this one because we are going to talk about the Flagler study in a little bit. So, Emil?
Okay, yeah. So the chief in Flagler, which was a jail that I used to work in, touted this Rhode Island study actually from the Journal of American Medical Association, September of 2022. And basically, this is a model of screening and protocol treatment for MAT launched within the Rhode Island Department of Corrections. And this study is used widely across the nation as an example of how successful MAT can be when incorporated into a jail setting or prison setting. Individuals arriving at Rhode Island DOC while receiving medications that they were on already would be able to maintain their respective medication regimen without tapering or discontinuing the medication. And this showed more than a 60% reduction in opioid overdose deaths amongst those who were recently incarcerated. And they were allowing people to begin their or induce their treatments while they were incarcerated or behind bars. And the research study showed that the deaths in the first 6 months of 2016 went from 26 deaths all the way down to 9 deaths in 2017. And those are pretty staggering numbers. So yeah, next slide, please.
Emil, thank you, brother. Thank you. And listen, that, let me go back to that for just a second, because in that study, these numbers, they are staggering. And I think just as importantly, they are beyond statistically significant. And for, our statistics folks in here, I'm certainly not one of them, but I understand what that means. It means pay attention. So you can't do this without talking about stigma, because it is a primary barrier in obtaining treatment for substance use disorders, especially when we're considering either methadone or buprenorphine. Because even today, with folks just dying like flies as a result of the craziness of opioids today, a lot of folks don't understand or they don't agree with using MAT to treat an opioid use disorder. They just either don't know or they refuse to believe that MAT is by far the most effective treatment available that you can use for an opioid use disorder. We can't ignore the impact of peer and family pressure either, both of which play significant roles in reinforcing that internal or that self-stigma. Look here, we have been in the SUD world particularly stigmatizing, ostracizing, jailing, ignoring, marginalizing, restricting, shaming, guilting, beating up on, and we've even been killing people with substance use disorders for more than the last 50 years. So people like us with this dirty little secret of addiction, we keep it that way because, we carry our own shame and guilt. And we're defensive because we have been persecuted for our drug use. And for some of us, that persecution has gone on for decades. And the vast majority of us already have enough shame and guilt. So if you don't know our history, you can't shame us and you can't hold us accountable either. Stigma towards those of us who use substances is so bad that when the World Health Organization did a study of 18 of the most stigmatized social problems across 14 different countries, drug addiction 1, alcohol addiction 4. And we get more stigma because there's poor health and mental and physical health is associated with substance use disorders. We've been approaching drugs and drug users the same punitive way for almost 100 years. We're worse off today than where we've ever been. We cannot ignore stigma and bias in the context of jail-based MAT programs because it is rampant, and I'm telling you, it will show up probably a lot as well-meaning but misguided folks hold on to some really outdated ideas for substance use treatment. This is not disparaging any folks. They're following what they've been told and what they know. Unfortunately, up until about 2000, we didn't have any information, no real science around what is happening with an opioid use disorder. We do today. And today we can point to actual brain interaction. It is a disease and we need to treat it like that. The only real glimmer of hope that we've seen over this time is the success we've experienced using peers to intervene and offer a different culture. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And a slow but growing embrace of the harm reduction efforts. We'll talk about that later too. But these two changes, just these two, have made a dramatic difference. And ending the stigma, or at least reducing it around medication for this disease, is going to help a lot. Now, because of these stigmatizing experiences, and they often are occurring multiple times daily, excuse me, and they're compounded by years and even decades of substance misuse, trust me when I tell you that the #1 killer of our brothers and sisters out there, it isn't overdose, it's stigma, because we won't come for treatment. Emil, headed to you, brother.
Yeah, thank you. So post-incarceration syndrome, returning citizens, especially those who have spent considerable time behind bars, often re-enter society with some serious challenges related to that experience. In addition, all the other challenges they face generally as they re-enter, things like institutionalized personality traits, which develop from traumatizing experiences as a result of being incarcerated. There can also be a chronic state of learned helplessness in the face of prison authorities and antisocial or maladaptive defenses dealing with prison environment, like behaviors adapted to deal with other prisoners or segregation rules. There's also PTSD, which comes from two different directions: pre-incarceration trauma, or trauma that was experienced while incarcerated. And we all know that includes sexual trauma as well. And we have also antisocial personality traits that are developed as a way to cope with abusive and traumatic nature of incarceration, and from adapting response and engaging behavior with the environment to deal with staff and other inmates. And we also know of social sensory deprivation syndrome, which is caused by long-term exposure to solitary confinement or places and environments that drastically reduce the social contact of any kind of sensory stimulation. These are serious challenges for anyone to overcome, and peer workers with a history of incarceration or substance use disorder are really the most effective tool in helping someone who has experienced these challenges and how to overcome them. The importance of peer support for social justice involved individuals. Next slide, Steve. Peer support, this is SAMHSA's definition of peer support, and it's defined as offering help based on the shared understanding, respect, and mutual empowerment between people in similar situations. A growing body of research on how peers can influence re-entry outcomes, either negatively or positively. Peer recovery support services, or PRSS programs, use the power of peers, people with lived experience in addiction, recovery, and successful reentry to help individuals successfully transition back to the community, and most importantly, prevent recidivism, which is what everyone wants, correction staff or peers, participants, whoever. Peer recovery support services have been shown to be a promising, positive approach to reentry. Peers can provide crucial social support and reduce barriers for substance use and recidivism, and reduce criminal behavior. Research has shown that many formerly incarcerated persons prefer to receive mentoring from another person who has been successful with their own reentry efforts. Peers with lived experience in reentry can recover, and they can share strategies from overcoming stigma, strengthening positive attitudes and beliefs, and increasing coping and strategies for people reentering the community. So there are some principles of reintegration, and reentering the community after jail or prison requires some work for the peer and the returning citizen. And you can think of these 5 reintegration principles. One of them is behavioral change will be required. People need opportunities to learn and practice these new perspectives, mindsets, approaches, and conflict resolution skills, both in the jail and in the community. Interventions are individualized and comprehensive. They need to be tailored to the needs of the individual and address multiple areas of life living, learning, working, parenting, partnering, etc. I even had to show someone recently how to text that had never, used a smartphone before. And it's like those small victories are why I do this work. People who choose their recovery pathway based on cultural values, socioeconomic status, behavioral needs, and the nature of their substance use disorder is called multiple pathways. So if you're not familiar with multiple pathways, it just means that it's based on the individual, and everyone's pathway can look different. Participants are partners in the process. This is easy to give lip service on, but it's really important to explore with the person and form relationships and partnerships. And what do they need in order to be a partner is knowledge, skills, believe in themselves, most importantly, and an invitation to become a partner. That was one of the hardest ones I had to learn as well. Stakeholders are engaged in the program development and planning because people who are impacted by incarceration, they are the best experts on, the services and supports that are needed to reconnect people with their lives and their communities. Organizations that serve reentering community needs need to be proactive when engaging with formerly incarcerated people and bring their family members engaged to help design programs. And finally, when working together to make a transition from prison to community seamless requires that reentry planning begin long before the person is released. And we say all the time that reentry planning should start at the moment a person is arrested. So this is a handout that we have called Understanding the Sequential Intercept Model and Why It Matters. So it's very important. We're not going to dive super deep into this, but it is very important for you to understand the role of peers as it pertains to this model. Specific examples I can think of that are most important are, the beginning of this intercept model at the moment of crisis support or hotlines, warm lines. We have a lot of peer warm lines. And then also at the end when planning for reentry or courts, drug courts, reentry, transitioning back to the community. Those are really important areas that peers should be integrated. But yeah, we're sharing these because you definitely need to be familiar with this model and you're likely going to run into it a lot. The SIM or sequential intercept model is used in criminal justice and corrections domain. It's highly touted by SAMHSA through their GAIN Center, and it's not going anywhere. It's going to be here a while. So facilitating successful reentry through peer recovery support services. Peer recovery coaching and peer mentoring processes that help the justice involved individuals. And there are many ways which this occurs. We explore the prospect of living a good life, remembering that post-incarceration syndrome of institutionalized personality, because often newly released individuals are in a chronic state of learned helplessness, as we mentioned before. And we need to develop practical approaches to setting and achieving goals. Many justice-involved people struggle with both short and long-term goal setting as a result of chaotic and unstable living conditions. We build trust together with those that may or may not be receiving services from supports in the future, like corrections staff or clinical staff. Corrections are often seen as an adversary rather than a potential source of support. And, technical assistance is a great way to bring correctional staff on to learning how to become part of the solution as like a recovery coach, which is something I had to do in one of my jail settings. Building a relationship. This is something that you're going to hear a lot through this training, and is one of the things I've learned through and through as a person in recovery and being involved with the system and then working as a peer within the system. Building relationships with probation, parole, corrections, public defenders, the judge, the state, all of these different areas. There's so much of a need to create the relationships there. And for me, an example I have was, upon my successful completion of the drug court program, I had developed such a good relationship with everyone involved in that they were able to help pull some felony charges from my record so that I wouldn't have to struggle with a level 2 background check while obtaining my peer credential. Other examples that I've seen work for other people is the courts being able to pull fines from collections to help someone attain their driver's license. Probation, actually having funds on hand to help support someone with housing or make recommendations for treatment, money to buy a bicycle, even early termination. And there's even programs that offer grace for people that are on community control for personal time where, they don't have to be monitored as long as it's reported. And even help becoming a certified recovery peer specialist. Peers are the key to building all these relationships. Where do we find qualified peers for reentry support? This is a great question. Individuals who have gone through the jail transition or prison back to the community are a huge valuable asset to providing peer recovery support services. And the chief in the jail from Flagler, he was always, his goal was to have someone go through the program and then come back around and work as a peer in his program. And you'll see kind of one of the examples of this in the next video we're about to show.
Only on 6 tonight, an exclusive look inside the Flagler County Jail and real raw conversations with inmates about the first ever all-in addiction treatment program inside the jail. The sheriff just gave a shocking number. He says 80% of all inmates coming into his jail are addicted to some sort of drug.
So just in the last couple of months, using federal grant money, he converted a section of the jail to help inmates with their addiction if they agreed to actually take the help. News 6's Eric Von Anken gets the first look at how the inmates say this is getting results together.
I committed a felony on St. Mary's Catholic Church.
Michelle Wilburn tells me she stole a donation bag from a Flagler County church. She was high at the time, she admits, yet again.
I have been in and out of jails and institutions all my life. What makes this time different? I'm gonna try not to cry.
Take your time.
Is that, I've lost a lot.
Good morning, guys.
This is what's different this time.
This is going to be ongoing, all right?
Inmates who are addicted to drugs or alcohol live together.
Perfect opportunity to practice in here.
And recover together. They spend every day, all day.
I've used for 40 years.
With each other.
All right, so we're going to back up.
And with their counselors. The first time addiction has ever been addressed inside the Flagler County Jail, the sheriff says.
If you're not treating the addiction or the mental health issue or the combination of both, then they're going to leave this jail and eventually they're going to come back.
Sheriff Staley estimates half of all inmates struggling with addiction do come back.
They're all, eating, breathing, sleeping, recovery.
So he asked the new jail chief to break the cycle and create 2 dedicated, isolated pods entirely for addicts, led by certified counselors.
I hear accountability.
And recovering addicts.
I was basically just like these guys, so.
One pod is for men.
I know too many people that are on drugs.
Like Joey Samuels, back at the Flagler County Jail now for a 14th time. His 2 brothers are also locked up, and so is his dad here at the same jail.
For the first time out of 14 times, I'm tired of coming here and being in this program. The biggest thing for me is the support. I've never had so many people sitting in one room support my sobriety, recovery, or even my absence away from my own county.
And this is our female housing unit.
The other pod is entirely for women, like Michelle Wilburn.
You've been trying a bunch of times, but you believe now with what you're learning, it's going to be different.
I know beyond a shadow of a doubt it's going to be different because something has changed within me that I didn't recognize before.
The inmates will graduate from the program and be released here in May, but it doesn't just end there. One of the other things that the program does is check out and figure out where these inmates are going to go after they walk out of those doors, whether it's a treatment facility with supportive family members or, if nothing else, a sober living facility. At the Flagler County Jail, Eric Von Anken getting results together. News 6.
So that's a great video and great example of when you have corrections leadership on board, how how something so successful can be implemented. And I was there from the foundation of that program. We built it from the ground up. I know they mentioned calling us counselors in there. We're actually peer support specialists. The chief really he wanted peers. He didn't want any clinical staff. He wanted peers because he's seen this program work in other areas, and he came from New York. upstate, and he had a very successful program implementing peer support with RAP and interactive journaling, wellness recovery action plan, if you guys aren't familiar with that. Yeah, and it was hugely successful. They just had a follow-up video to this. Not everyone in the video made it, but one of the guys is actually coming back around to be that peer that hopefully will be able to work in that jail setting. And he's doing great. He's well on his way to getting his credentials. So, it's just really exciting. The numbers on recidivism have significantly reduced. Only 8 people have reoffended out of 33, I think, that started the program. So that's a big success. And the people that have reoffended are able to re-enter the program without any restrictions. That's really important, because a lot of times, they want to be punitive and say, oh, well, you came once already and, you can't be in the program again. But we want to give them unlimited opportunities for success, because we never know when that person might pick it up and say, this is the time where they want to get recovery. All right, we can move to the next one. Oh, yeah.
There we go. Sorry, had a little technical glitch there.
Thank you. So dreams don't work unless you do. As you can see, there are a lot of different areas ripe for peer support and reentry, and the benefits that peer workers can bring. We can fill identified service gaps. That is a huge one. Identifying and reducing barriers, provide expert targeted knowledge across an agency or an organization as a whole. From internal and external communication resources, committee structures, just to name a few. Peers also influence and expand the agency culture to overall recovery orientation. Hugely important to have that recovery culture wherever peers are. Peers also bring a cohort of known talent for career development, job hunting, interpersonal relations, sobriety ending, reducing the use of illicit substances or misuse, and train targeted pieces of their own recovery, not to relive the old days, but to point out places along the journey where things may have went awry, and providing valuable coaching and mentoring to help model for the returning citizen. Barriers and challenges to successful reentry. There's a lot. One of the reasons reentry is so challenging is because multiple barriers that are often like dominoes. When one comes up, 2 or 3 more, may show up right behind it. So it's like whack-a-mole. Unstable housing is a huge problem, or homelessness for people, and it may include peripheral barriers like the type of conviction, felony versus misdemeanor, past evictions, past convictions, being in the arrears, unemployment, no employment, insufficient employment, lack of, fair paying wages. Stigma from the community mainstream is a major barrier to almost everything for a returning citizen. Studies have shown that less than 2 people in 10 would be okay with a justice-involved individual working alongside them. That's tough. Or having them next door and engaging them with family members or in any capacity. These barriers can be absolutely overwhelming for a returning citizen and can destroy hope and any desire to try and accomplish more. When a person loses hope, they're at high risk of developing a maladaptive coping mechanism, and it usually can end up in a return to prison or return to use. One thing I do want to add here, there's a specific challenge around a justice-involved person like myself working alongside correction staff. And I have faced this challenge head on. It's not easy. Peers have to be integrated properly into these roles. And when they're not, there's definitely some consequences that come down. Potential peer support interventions for reentry barriers and or challenges. Peers bring so much to the table, especially when working in reentry. Some interventions that we can bring to the challenges and barriers are assisting with court-related issues. This is one I've done a lot of. Engaging with law enforcement, bringing their own recovery forward as an example and a model. I had to do that when I was in the jail and I wasn't integrated properly. I had to, speak to the officers, introduce myself to them as a person in recovery and a person who had been previously incarcerated. And that didn't go over so well. It was about 50-50. Some of the officers were on board with it and some, immediately had their implicit bias come in. Mentoring and advocating for peers when they can't advocate for themselves is a big deal. You know, when I was in drug court, I had to advocate for myself to be, you know, to get medication assisted treatment. And I didn't have peers. Peer roles haven't been integrated well here, especially in drug court. So it was a huge challenge for me to stand up. I was the first peer that was allowed to be on MAT in my area. So, and I opened doors for other people behind me, which was a good, you know, a good thing. Also helping newcomers navigate drug court or using MAT in drug court. And another thing that I'm doing recently is mentoring people through the supervision process, because it can be challenging to be on probation. I know that I wasn't able to complete probation for the first 10 times I tried it. So yeah, so those are some key areas we can help, you know, get people over the hump. This is a handout that we have on the value of peers. And because we're still some folks who are skeptical of peer support, the data's in and it's becoming more clear every day that peers help in so many ways, and it's branching out into primary care. We see peers in ERs, neonatal units, crisis teams. I've seen them even in elder care, and that use continues to expand. Peer support has taken an evidence approach since 2007, has been proven again and again to work and work well. But peers don't operate in a vacuum and must work in complementary and collaborative roles with the rest of the community support and services, whether it's law enforcement, jail staff, clinicians, primary care, behavioral health. Peers bring recovery support to most of us, either in active use or in treatment and recovery support. So if you're missing one or the other, it typically will not be successful.
Emil, thank you, man. I'm telling you, the video it brings tears to my eyes, because I know, you know, anybody who sat there and who's wondered, what do I do now? It's super powerful, brother. Thank you for what you've done. It's just really impressive too.
I'm going to put the follow-up video in the chat, Stephen.
Thank you. That's awesome. I want to talk a minute about the subcultures of addiction, incarceration, and their influence on not just the pre-contemplative person, but on a lot of us who are in active use. So addiction and incarceration both have, and if you've ever been either, you know, they have very distinct subcultures. And that means that they each have their own very distinct rules, some daily activities that you do, relationship etiquette, the kind of language you use, and values that all create, it's going to sound crazy, but it's a welcoming place for people who have these histories. This sounds maladaptive and crazy, but we thrived in those places. What happens though is it creates two really different physical and cultural worlds that we're navigating through. Subcultures play a critical role in both the initiation and the daily maintenance of an addiction, and they can be really major obstacles to a successful recovery. You can become as addicted to a culture of addiction as you are to the central tenet of that culture, which is the actual use of the opioid, or, you know, whatever the addictive material is. And altering that, it really requires changes, sometimes really hard ones, in the person's relationship to that subculture. The people, the places, and the things that have supported the person-drug relationship, sometimes for decades. And the amount of change needed varies, and it's based on whether you are either isolated from that addiction culture, or it's called acultural style, or that you're involved in both the mainstream and the addiction culture, that is the bicultural style, or you exist almost exclusively within the culture of addiction, or the enmeshed style. And it's within that enmeshed style you find most folks who use opioids, because there's a need for a really tight circle of people who can help meet that, you know, that every day, every, you know, 4-hour demand that we have. And here's the thing, a fully enmeshed person knows how to function in that environment way better than in the mainstream one. Now, I'm going to generalize here, but as a person in active addiction, and especially folks in early recovery, as they're pulled toward the mainstream culture, he or she's going to stick a toe in that recovery water of that mainstream culture, but they'll keep that other foot really firmly planted back in their subculture. And if anything stressful or negative occurs from interactions in mainstream, it's not only easy to go home, it's embraced as a return to the fold by members enmeshed in that subculture itself. Now, Bill White tells us that people with that enmeshed style of addiction, they're going to need a period of decompression and then a parallel enmeshment within the subculture of recovery in order to get stabilized and enjoy some maintenance of that recovery. They very well may need guides to assist them through that journey and cross from the subculture to the mainstream culture. Allies like recovery coaches and peer specialists, as well as culturally competent and importantly, really compassionate addiction professionals, vital. They are vital in making that shift. And Bill goes on to say that it's important to remind ourselves of the role of culture and subculture in the processes of addiction and recovery. Because if recovery is a journey between two worlds, then we better provide a fully developed culture of recovery to overcome that pull back to the old subculture. Now, it's easier said than done, I get it, but it can be done. It took me moving 3,000 miles from the area I used in, a complete cutoff of all the people I used to associate with, and then years, and I mean it, years of working to remove myself from all the vestiges of those subcultural behaviors, the specialized language, and the comfort and familiarity that comes from spending like 40 years fully enmeshed in it. And I'll tell you, it's been 23 years now since I used an illegal substance or I participated in any of the subcultures I belonged to, and there were several, but I am still extracting some of the maladaptive behaviors and the language that I've been using for decades. It's not easy. This is a big one because it matters. We have to recognize the influence and the draw power of these subcultures. We talk all the time about the importance of cultural competency, cultural proficiency. I don't know how we've happened to miss this most important cultural piece, but we're not going to miss it anymore. So what we need to do is revise some of our engagement strategies. Some of them revisions. It may include things like identifying intercept places, like contact locations where we can catch folks who are, and actively doing their thing. We need to act as a bridge to the services and supports, and really importantly, the recovery culture, as well as our larger community, the mainstream one. Engaging with multiple cultural competencies, and then understanding how we can suspend. You can never get rid of your biases, but you can suspend them long enough to provide compassionate, strengths-based, trauma-informed services. And then we need to be able to engage around something that really matters to the person. Ending the dope sick, for example. And here's what I mean, and I'll just speak for myself, but I suspect my story is going to resonate with some other folks who've had similar experiences. But near the end of a 35-year-old opioid addiction, my focus wasn't on getting high. I hardly ever got high. It was on staying well. And if you've ever force kicked due to the lack of money or drug access or being locked up, as many times as many of us have who have long histories here, the only thing that drives your behavior is that need to remain well. And I don't know or care at all at that time what recovery meant, because the only thing that mattered was remaining well. And my days were always singularly focused like a laser on making sure that occurred above all other things. Now, as I went through that, a culturally competent approach to me at that time would have went something like this. And this, man, if a recovery coach would have come to me with this, I'm telling you, listen, man, I know that a dope sick is headed your way. And it's really appropriate that you use the appropriate subcultural language if you want any cred with that person. Can't go in there talking, incarceration and, substance use disorder. You need to talk to the people that you're engaging with on their level. Meet them where they're at, right? So I know this dope sick is headed your way soon. And I know in my own experience, man, it was horrible. It was like being held hostage. What if I told you that I could end that dope sick for you today before your nose even starts to run? And we can do it for free. And I can make sure you have your dose for tomorrow and the next day and the next day for as long as you need it, and you'll never have to chase another bag or a pouch again. Are you interested in checking it out? I got a ride here, no cops, no hassles, just getting well for the last time and then staying well for the rest of your life. If somebody in recovery from an OUD would have approached me like this, I'd have followed that person right off a cliff, because it's the first time somebody spoke in language I could understand, had done it him or herself, and they know what I'm about to go through. You can see the compassion, the hope, and the love of a brother and sister trying to save your life, and you know it too. Now, the punitive policies of the early 90s, they have failed. They don't deter drug use, and they don't do anything for the stigma. The risk-facing criminal penalties has really discouraged us from seeking help, and then added to the risky practices that increase infection, disease, and death. Now, law enforcement assisted diversion, or LEAD, these programs give police discretion to actually divert people who have some behavioral health needs, including substance use treatment. There was a 3-year eval in the Seattle program that showed LEAD participants fared better in multiple ways when you compared them to control participants who were arrested, taken into custody, and had criminal charges filed against them. Evidence-based medications like methadone and buprenorphine help people remain in treatment. It decreases illicit opioid use, and it reduces criminal activity. But unfortunately, the justice system, and especially courts and corrections professionals, they've just been slow to integrate MAT, as we talked about earlier. And a 2010 study, it was a survey of drug courts, showed that although 98% reportedly had people with opioid addictions, only 56% offered MAT. Overdose education and naloxone distribution is less established across the criminal justice system, but even that number has increased. There's been a North Carolina study that found that formerly incarcerated people 40 times more likely to die. And we talked about this before, 2 weeks post-release. And the strategies to reduce the harms that come with drug use don't always take place at specific criminal justice intercepts, but they still need cooperation from our criminal justice system. Things like access to SCPs, syringe service programs, are critical resources in stopping disease, infection, and they're super important. But law enforcement will usually discourage the use of these facilities, and they do it by targeting enforcement efforts around a needle exchange site, and then pop you for drug paraphernalia when you're coming back to get a new syringe. They also might be unaware or just unfamiliar with the benefits of a syringe program, like the reduction in the number of needle stick injuries that law enforcement officers experience. Harm reduction works to save lives, especially the lives of reentering citizens. Emil?
Yes, thank you, Steve. I just wanted to tap on one more point there on the harm reduction. We were able to implement Narcan trainings to everyone that came in the door in the jail I worked at. And there was so much pushback from the officers on that. But my thinking was like, why? The only reason would be that you don't care if this person lives. But it goes back to more education and training. So yeah, strengthening the social capital of incarcerated or reentering persons. The corrections approach is punitive, not person-centered. So education on addiction as a disease and not a moral failing is super important. I was able to get technical assistance from ORN to get the correction staff up to speed on what addiction is on a factual basis, that there is meaningful ways to reduce recidivism. And what they really like is that it improves security and public safety upon release. Peers, when integrated properly into a reentry setting, can be the example that recovery is possible, and a peer who has successfully navigated their program, jail, or prison and returned to be a part of the solution is especially impactful. Building relationships with corrections leadership and staff. Again, we've mentioned it before, building relationships, building trust and communication, and particularly with the leadership. That's where the goal is. When correctional facility leaders and staff trust and appreciate external program staff, these programs will generally operate with fewer restrictions and greater privileges, including potentially having a designated space within the facility. And I was able to even get them to allow me to bring in coffee and soups for the participants in our program, because I saw that hunger was a big problem in causing conflicts. And that was only through a relationship that I developed with the leadership. Participants will benefit from the program being able to operate as needed, as I just mentioned, and highlight program benefits to the correction staff. So you have to sell it to them in a way that they're going to appreciate. The programs appear to have more challenges building strong relationships with correctional officers or on the ground staff. Interviewees observed that correctional officers are trained to have a more punitive orientation and focus on safety and security of the facility. So you have to sell it to them in that way, which sometimes leads to a lot of resistance. But if you can help them understand that it's going to be safer for them, then they're more likely to buy into it. Emerging social capital practices. Reentry peer workers need to understand that emerging social capital practices in order to increase a returning citizen's own social capital. So we know that peer groups and cohort approaches can help participants share experiences, build networks, and develop more personal relationships. We can help build connections with participants over time through intensity of interaction. Organizations and peers both have social capital that can create and build connections. Technology enhances and helps build community among participants, and data helps us understand how social capital can improve outcomes. I was able to have a sponsor in Australia who did Zoom videos and mutual aid groups while he was incarcerated. And I thought that was amazing. We worked together for a year. Peers know that organic connections are often the most important, and organizations need to improve both space and time to develop them. Hiring individuals with similar experiences facilitates and speeds the process of having the voice of people who use their services or could have used them and then been available are essential in developing or revising programming and even staffing. Peers know that social capital increases when individuals hold each other accountable, and organizations can promote this through written and or verbal agreements. Integration, I mentioned this before, our reentry planning should start at arrest, and that looks like basically creating programs with leadership, and you have to of course have agency approval to get a reentry peer to help eliminate or reduce these barriers, and providing services pre-release, a critical important component of reentry. Contact at release, preferably in person. Walking people out the door was a big deal. Supporting inmate needs like rapid access to needed medications, having them be able to follow up post-release with a prescription in their hands, also a big deal. And then continuing regular contact throughout the reentry process. One of the reasons why the program I worked at has been so successful is because I have continued contact with them post-release. It's vital for employer and corrections staff to provide guidance in determining the best process for these engagements within and outside the facility, because without their buy-in and assistance, the lift will be likely too big to be accomplished by the peer alone. And that was one of the reasons why I ended up leaving that program. This is drug court. You want to play the video, Steve?
Sure.
Drug
addiction has become an unprecedented public health crisis. We cannot solve this with incarceration. Drug courts are part of the solution. Drug courts, also called treatment courts, are specialized court programs for persons with substance use disorders. Instead of simply going to jail, the programs give people the opportunity to enter long-term treatment and agree to court supervision. Drug courts address the root causes of drug use and criminal behavior, like poverty, mental health issues, physical health, and unemployment. Participants in drug court maintain recovery from drugs, take on responsibilities, and work towards lifestyle changes. Members of the court help participants in their progress towards these goals and hold them accountable for lapses in improvement. Unlike traditional court, drug courts take a collaborative approach to justice. The judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, and probation official work collaboratively. As a team, they use their individual expertise in partnership with public health professionals, such as treatment providers, social services, and mental health specialists. Together, they seek solutions that benefit the participant. Ultimately, drug courts reduce crime and affect real change in lives. To learn more, visit ndcrc.org.
So I'm a drug court graduate, and I absolutely love drug court. It wasn't, peers weren't integrated into the drug court program when I was there, but and you see in that circle of the team, they're still not in there, but it's definitely starting to see change around that. Drug courts started in 1989 in Miami-Dade with the war on drugs. Judges and law enforcement were frustrated that so many people were moving through the system, and they all had substance use disorder or contributed to their criminal behavior. So yeah, they cycled through the system more than one time and then charged with nonviolent crimes and repeat that process. I did that myself. So we use specialized dockets in drug court to target adults charged with or convicted of a crime, or youth juvenile systems as well. There's also a veterans court, and I think parents with pending child welfare cases have a treatment court or dependency court as well. As you can see on the graph on the right, in 2004, the word about successes occurring in drug court caught on fire with the justice system. And in 2019, 38,563 treatment courts were operational within the United States. 90% of those service adults and 9% service juveniles. They operate quite differently than traditional courts, and as we saw in the video, they take a collaborative approach. So drug courts in the US are cutting time and saving money. Do they work? Sending someone to a drug court instead of a state prison can save up to $13,000 per participant. Family drug courts reduce the likelihood of reentry into foster care by 2/3. Every US state and territory utilizes drug court. Adult drug courts reduce recidivism by as much as 45%. And 75% of drug court graduates remain arrest-free compared to 30% of those released from prison. Juvenile drug courts reduce recidivism by as much as 40%. So there's no doubt that drug courts work. And I am standing here as 100% example of that effectiveness. Yeah, so final thoughts, I'll go here first. This is a picture of me on my last arrest, March 25th, 2018. Drug court saved my life. I was made repeat revolving door in the probation system. Finally, someone saw that I needed help and got me recommended for treatment. A peer, if in that role, could have helped advocate for me to get treatment because I had no idea how to get it for myself. But yeah, through successful completion of the program and having their support, I'm able to return to that court today, advocate for others. I have a very good relationship with the entire court, the judge especially, and I'm close personal friends with the public defender now, and I'm just blessed and successful in my recovery. That picture really does me a number. That's all I got. Thanks, Steve.
Emil, brother, I am beyond proud of you too, man. I know what it took. And I know that lifestyle, and I know how hard it is to get out. I know how hard it is to get out of the criminal justice system. And brother, you have done it. And not only have you done it, you stand as a model. You stand as a, as a coach and mentor. And I think you bring a lot of hope to brothers and sisters who have been struggling, and that's what matters, right? And folks, throughout all day today, you've heard snippets of both Emil's and my recovery journey. Mine wouldn't have been possible without the help and support of people who had similar pasts, but they had been able to figure out how to leave that subculture, join the mainstream community, and never look back, except that they desperately wanted to give back to those we know that are struggling, that are trapped in those subcultures, and they got no coach, no mentor, or role model that they can look at for alternatives. Peers bring that alternative, and if they hadn't, I promise you, I would not be here today doing this work. I'd already overdosed 3 times by the time I'd entered recovery. And you know what they say, if you've got one overdose, you are much more susceptible to dying from an overdose. I spent my time just waiting to die while I was in active addiction. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for the support, because it meant everything to me. It still does. And every day as I help other people learn about recovery, my own recovery grows stronger. And at the end of the day, it's what we want for everyone that's involved with the justice system, with treatment providers and all of the other forms of support now available. That picture of me up there, that's me on the right. If you couldn't tell, we both had long hair. That's at Folsom Prison. That was 97. Those years are a blur because they were filled with black tar heroin. So I'm standing in front of you today, a person in recovery, haven't used an illicit substance in 23 years, still using medication-assisted treatment. Medication-assisted treatment saved my life. Recovery made my life awesome. So I want to thank everybody here for the time you all spent with us today. We know every one of you is busy. Any training that you attend, it better have value. And we hope that you found some value in this presentation today. We're happy to answer any questions you might have. We've got about 7 minutes left, and I'll turn this back to Carrie.
Thank you so much to both of you. So much invaluable information, the data, the stats, the reference materials, the personal stories. You guys just embody strength and hope. And, when I look at, the drug court, I think about, what you commented in the chat for somebody who was talking about some of the stuff that's going on in terms of the things that aren't working in the criminal justice involved. And, that stat to me shows that symbol of hope that, the more persistence, the more people we have out there saying this works, look, this has worked for me, the more people we're going to get to change the system and change the way things are. So thank all of you for attending today, because you're part of that change. And please just stay on for a moment longer. Emily, do you have the QR code to do the survey? Because again, not only does it drive the funding, but it gives us the feedback to make sure that this presentation is what you're looking for and helps us plan for future presentations. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a few minutes, we'd appreciate it.